The king who burned his own country. The Shah of Iran, how a man became a god and then nothing at all. Prologue, the party at the end of the world. October 1971. Persepolis, Iran. In the middle of the desert, at the ruins of a palace that had not been inhabited for 2,000 years. A king threw the most expensive party in human history. 600 guests. Heads of state, royalty, and dignitaries from 69 nations. Flown in from across the world on special chartered flights. The tents were designed by Maison Janssen, the French interior design firm that had decorated the Élysée Palace and Buckingham Palace. 5,000 trees were planted in the desert overnight to create the illusion of a garden. 50,000 songbirds were imported from Europe. The food was catered entirely from Maxims of Paris, flown in daily on refrigerated aircraft. The menu included quail eggs stuffed with caviar, roast peacock, and 50 kinds of wine. The cost was somewhere between $200 million and $300 million. In a country where half the population still lived without running water. In a country where his own secret police were, at that exact moment, operating torture chambers in the basements of Tehran. The Shah stood at the tomb of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, dead for 2,500 years, and spoke directly to him. "Cyrus," he said, "rest in peace. We are awake." The world press photographed him in his military uniform, covered in medals he had awarded himself, surrounded by the ruins of an empire that was not his, claiming the inheritance of a civilization he had not built. The Iranian people watched from a distance. Most of them were not invited. 8 years later, the same people who had not been invited to his party dragged him out of his country forever. He died in exile. Alone. Sick. Moving from country to country because nobody wanted him. The man who had called himself the King of Kings, the shadow of God, the light of the Aryans, died in a hospital room in Cairo, with almost no one at his side. This is Chronicle Arcanum. This is the story of a man who confused a throne for a country, and paid the price that kings always pay when they forget the difference. Act 1, The Boy Who Became King. Chapter 1, The Wrong Son. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was not supposed to be the Shah. He was the son of a man who was supposed to be a temporary solution. His father, Reza Khan, was a soldier. A rough, uneducated cavalry officer who rose through the ranks through sheer physical dominance and tactical intelligence. In 1921, he led a coup against the collapsing Qajar dynasty. In 1925, he declared himself Shah, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. He was not subtle. He modernized Iran with a ferocity that bordered on violence. He banned the veil. He forced men to wear Western suits. He built roads, railways, factories. He created a national army and a national bureaucracy. He also tortured opponents, suppressed minorities, and took land from anyone who challenged him. The British and the Russians watched him carefully. They did not like him, but they needed his oil and his geography. Then World War II arrived. Iran tried to stay neutral. Reza Shah had a certain admiration for Germany, not because he was a Nazi, but because Germany was the one major power that had never colonized or pressured Iran. Germany represented, to him, the possibility of modernization without submission. The British and Soviets did not care about his reasoning. In August 1941, without a formal declaration of war, British and Soviet forces simultaneously invaded Iran from the south and the north. They arrested Reza Shah. They sent him into exile. First to Mauritius, then to South Africa, where he died in 1944. And in his place, they installed his son. Mohammad Reza was 21 years old. He had been educated partly in Switzerland. He was shy, uncertain. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of a father who was everything he was not: physically imposing, brutally confident, completely comfortable with power. The young Shah was none of those things. He was a man who wanted to be a great king, but had not yet figured out who he was. The British and Soviets had chosen well. They thought a weak king was easy to manage. They were wrong about what he would become. Chapter 2: The Lesson of 1953. For the first decade of his reign, Mohammad Reza Shah was exactly what the great powers wanted. Cautious, manageable, dependent. He was so dependent, in fact, that when Mossadegh rose to power in 1951 and began the oil nationalization that threatened British interests, the Shah was not even the one who resisted. He was so frightened of Mossadegh's popularity that he briefly fled the country, leaving for Rome, hiding in a hotel, while the CIA operation to save his throne was conducted without him. He returned to Tehran in August 1953, restored to power by foreign agents, by bribed mobs, by 2 suitcases of CIA cash. And that experience shaped everything that followed. Because the Shah learned 2 lessons from 1953. The first lesson: his power was not his own. It was borrowed from Washington. And borrowed power could be taken back. The second lesson: he must never be in that position again. He must never be the weak, uncertain young man who flees to Rome while other people decide his fate. From 1953 onward, the Shah began to build something. Not just a government. A fortress. Chapter 3: SAVAK. The Organization of National Security and Intelligence. In Persian, Sezmani Etelat va Amniyati Keshvar. SAVAK. It was founded in 1957, with direct assistance from the CIA and Mossad. The CIA provided training in surveillance techniques, interrogation methods, and the organizational structure of a modern intelligence service. Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, provided additional training and maintained close operational ties with SAVAK for decades. This was not a secret. It was policy. At its peak, SAVAK employed between 15 and 60,000 full-time agents. The range is uncertain because SAVAK also maintained a vast network of informants, university professors, taxi drivers, shopkeepers, neighbors, who reported on the conversations around them in exchange for small payments or the guarantee of not being reported themselves. Iran became a country where you did not know who was listening, where you did not speak freely in your own home, where a conversation in a tea house about politics could lead to a knock on the door at 3 in the morning. SAVAK's methods were documented extensively by Amnesty International throughout the 1970s. Electric shocks, sleep deprivation, the extraction of fingernails, burning with cigarettes. A device called the Apollo, an Iron Maiden-like contraption that enclosed the body and applied heat. sexual violence, mock executions. By the mid-1970s, Amnesty International estimated that Iran had over 100,000 political prisoners. 100,000 in a country of 33 million people. And in Washington, the response was a toast. An island of stability, President Carter would call Iran in 1977. An island of stability built on a foundation of screaming. Act 2, The White Revolution and its Contradictions. Chapter 4, Modernizing at Gunpoint. Here is the complexity that makes the Shah impossible to reduce to a simple villain. In 1963, he launched the White Revolution. 6 points, later expanded to 19. Land reform, women's suffrage, literacy corps, health corps, forest nationalization, profit sharing for factory workers. These were not small things. The land reform was genuinely significant. For centuries, Iranian peasants had worked the land of feudal landlords under conditions of near serfdom. The Shah's reform distributed millions of acres to rural families. It broke the power of the traditional land-owning class. Women gained the right to vote, to run for office, to become judges, to divorce on equal terms with men. Iran's literacy rate doubled in a decade. The economy grew at an extraordinary rate through the 1960s. Iranian universities produced engineers, doctors, and architects. Tehran was being rebuilt as a modern city. The middle class expanded. If you were educated, secular, and comfortable, Iran in the 1960s and early 1970s was a genuinely exciting place to be. But here is the problem. The White Revolution was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. The Shah did not build a coalition. He did not bring religious leaders into the conversation. He did not create political space for debate or opposition. He announced his reforms. And if you opposed them, Savak would be interested in your name. The result was a paradox. A country being pulled into the 20th century by one hand while being held down by the other. And the people who were most threatened by his reforms, the traditional clergy, the bazaar merchants, the religious establishment, were precisely the people he had no mechanism to manage except repression. He modernized the country, but he destroyed the political institutions that might have made that modernization stable. There was no parliament worth the name, no free press, no independent judiciary. No political parties operated without Savak supervision. There was only the Shah. And when people's lives did not improve as fast as they expected, there was no one to complain to. No ballot box. No opposition candidate. No outlet. Only silence. Or Savak. Chapter 5. The Nixon Doctrine and the Policemen of the Gulf. In 1969, Richard Nixon announced a new foreign policy doctrine. America, exhausted by Vietnam, would no longer send its own soldiers to fight proxy wars in the developing world. Instead, it would arm regional allies and let them do the fighting. The Shah was the perfect candidate. Iran sat at the intersection of every American strategic interest in the region. It bordered the Soviet Union to the north. It controlled the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 40% of the world's oil supply passed. It was militarily capable, and its leader was enthusiastically, almost desperately, pro-American. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, flew to Tehran in May 1972. In a meeting that lasted less than an hour, they offered the Shah something no American president had offered any foreign leader before or since. He could buy any conventional weapon in the American arsenal. Any of it. Without the normal review process. Without congressional oversight. Without the usual interagency debate about whether a particular weapon system was appropriate to transfer. Any weapon. In any quantity. At any speed, he could absorb. The Shah ordered immediately. Between 1972 and 1977, Iran purchased over $20 billion of American weapons. F-14 Tomcat fighter jets, the most advanced fighter aircraft in the American inventory, the same planes that would be featured in Top Gun a decade later. Destroyers. AWACS surveillance aircraft. Laser-guided bombs. Sophisticated electronic warfare systems. The American defense industry was overwhelmed with Iranian orders. Factories ran extra shifts. Thousands of American military technicians and their families relocated to Iran to maintain the equipment and train Iranian crews. At its peak, there were 40,000 American citizens living in Iran. Military advisors, defense contractors, technicians, intelligence officers. Iran had become, in the words of one American senator, an American military colony. And the Shah loved every minute of it. He genuinely believed he was building something that would outlast him. A military power capable of policing the Persian Gulf, suppressing Soviet influence, and eventually, in his most ambitious visions, projecting Iranian power across the entire Indian Ocean region. He called himself the policeman of the Gulf. Washington called him the same thing. What neither of them fully accounted for was the people inside the country being policed. Chapter 6: The Oil Money and the Mirage. October 1973. The Arab oil embargo. OPEC, responding to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, cut oil production and quadrupled prices overnight. For Iran, which was not part of the Arab embargo, this was a windfall beyond imagination. The Shah's oil revenues went from less than $3 billion a year to over $20 billion a year. Almost overnight. And the Shah lost his mind with it. He went on a spending spree that had no precedent in modern history. He ordered hundreds of billions of dollars of American weapons. Fighter jets. Destroyers. Attack helicopters. Sophisticated electronic warfare systems that American pilots were still being trained to use. The American defense industry could not fulfill the orders fast enough. He announced ambitions to make Iran the world's fifth largest economy by 1985. He hired 100,000 foreign technicians, American, European, Korean, to staff industries that Iran's own workforce was not yet trained to operate. He built nuclear reactors, steel mills, petrochemical plants, a rapid transit system for Tehran, airports, universities, hospitals, all at once, simultaneously, with no plan for how to absorb the transformation. The result was runaway inflation. Goods poured into Iran's ports faster than they could be distributed. Traffic jams of ships waiting to unload lasted for months. Refrigerators and televisions sat in warehouses because there were no trucks to carry them inland. The people who had been brought to Tehran to work in the new industries found themselves living in slums on the edges of the city, displaced from rural communities they had known for generations, unable to afford the consumer goods that the economy they were building was producing. They were modern, but they were not comfortable. And into that specific discontent, modern, frustrated, educated, not poor but not prosperous, cut off from tradition without being fully absorbed into modernity, walked a 75-year-old cleric from a cassette tape. Act 3, The Revolution. Chapter 6, The Cassette Tapes of Ayatollah Khomeini. Ruhollah Khomeini had been in exile since 1964. The Shah had expelled him because Khomeini refused to stop speaking. Against the White Revolution. Against women's rights, which he called an insult to Islam. Against the Status of Forces Agreement, which gave American military personnel in Iran immunity from Iranian law. Against the Shah himself, whom he called a servant of America. Savak had arrested him, beaten him, expelled him. He went first to Turkey, then to Najaf in Iraq, then, in 1978, to a small house in the Paris suburb of Neaufle-le-Château. And from that small house in the suburbs of Paris, he spoke to Iran. Not on television, not on the radio, on cassette tapes. His lieutenants recorded his sermons in Paris, duplicated them by the thousands, and smuggled them into Iran hidden in ordinary packaging. Cassette tapes of music. Blank tapes. Tapes wrapped in the covers of legitimate recordings. In the mosques, the one institution that Savak could not fully infiltrate because the cost of doing so would have been too politically dangerous, these tapes were played after Friday prayers. Khomeini was not an ideological moderate offering a carefully reasoned critique of authoritarianism. He was a prophet offering clarity. The Shah was corrupt. The Shah served foreign masters. The Shah had sold Iran's soul to America and Israel. The Shah was the enemy of God. This was not a nuanced analysis. But nuanced analysis was not what people needed in 1978. What they needed was someone who could name the thing they felt. And Khomeini could name it. What he could not do, what he would not do, was promise what came after the Shah. He was deliberately vague. He spoke of Islamic governance, of justice, of the return of Iranian dignity. The students heard democracy and freedom from oppression. The communists heard the end of capitalist exploitation. The feminists heard liberation from a regime that used women as symbols of modernization while torturing their husbands in its basements. The merchants heard the end of inflation and foreign economic control. Everyone heard what they needed to hear. And by the autumn of 1978, millions of Iranians were in the streets. Chapter 7, The Shah's Paralysis. Here is the detail that most histories of the Iranian Revolution skip. The Shah knew. He knew in 1977 that something was building. His intelligence service, which had spent decades monitoring every political discussion in Iran, reported to him accurately on the scope of the discontent. He knew. And he could not decide what to do. There are two explanations, and both are probably true. The first He was sick. Since 1974, the Shah had been secretly treated for chronic lymphocytic leukemia. The illness was hidden from the Iranian public, from his cabinet, and from his American patrons. Only a tiny circle of physicians and family members knew. A man dying slowly of cancer, managing his symptoms with medications that affected his cognition, was making the decisions about how to handle the largest political crisis of his reign. The second, he was caught between two advisors who disagreed on everything. His American patrons, the Carter administration, were deeply conflicted. Carter had won the presidency partly on a human rights platform. His administration had been pushing the Shah, quietly, to ease up on Savak, to allow some political liberalization, to reduce the number of political prisoners. And now, as the revolution was building, the Carter administration could not agree on what they wanted. Some advisors said, support the Shah completely, send military backing, crush the uprising. Others said, the Shah is finished, we need to negotiate a transition. The Shah, watching Washington argue, received no clear signal. No clear order to use maximum force. No clear permission to negotiate. He was abandoned in the most complete sense possible. Not by anyone who announced their abandonment, but by the slow, bureaucratic, committee-driven paralysis of a superpower that could not decide what it wanted. In September 1978, the Shah declared martial law. On September 8, Black Friday, troops opened fire on protesters in Jala Square in Tehran. Estimates of the dead range from dozens to hundreds. The killing did not end the revolution. It ended the Shah's legitimacy. After Black Friday, the question was not whether the Shah would fall. It was only when. Chapter 8: The Exile. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi boarded a plane at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. He told the public he was taking a vacation for his health. He never came back. His farewell at the airport was watched by crowds of officials, some of whom were weeping. The Shah himself was photographed walking across the tarmac in his military uniform, his face composed, his back straight. But people who were close to him that day described something different. He was shaking. Not from cold. When the plane lifted off the runway and climbed above Tehran, the Shah looked out the window at the city below him, the city he had tried to transform, the country he had tried to make great, the people he had tried to modernize. His pilot said later that the Shah wept and said nothing. The plane landed in Egypt, where President Sadat, one of the few leaders who would remain loyal to him, received him with a state welcome. From Egypt, the Shah traveled to Morocco, then the Bahamas, then Mexico. He needed medical treatment. His leukemia, now public, was advancing. The Carter administration refused to let him enter the United States for treatment. The politics were too complicated. The new Iranian government was making demands. The hostages, taken later, in November, were in Iranian hands. Admitting the Shah would enrage Tehran. Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller lobbied Carter personally to admit him. Carter eventually relented. The Shah came to New York Hospital in October 1979 for treatment. 2 weeks later, the American embassy in Tehran was stormed. 52 Americans were taken hostage. The connection to the Iranians was direct. America had sheltered the man who had run the torture chambers. America had shown its true loyalties. The Shah left New York, went to Panama, then back to Egypt. He died in Cairo on July 27, 1980. He was 60 years old. He was buried in the El Rifai Mosque in Cairo, far from the tomb of Cyrus the Great he had addressed 9 years earlier. There was no state funeral in Iran. There was no moment of official mourning. The Islamic Republic had already erased him. His statues were pulled down. His name was removed from public places. His legacy was officially designated as nothing more than tyranny and foreign servitude. What remained were the consequences. And the consequences were just beginning. Act 4, The Long Shadow. Chapter 9, What the Shah Left Behind. Here is what the Shah actually left Iran. He left a modernized economy that was more brittle than it looked. The oil wealth had created infrastructure but not institutions. The industrial base required foreign technicians to operate. When those technicians fled after the revolution, entire sectors of the economy stopped functioning. He left an educated middle class that was, by the standards of the region, genuinely significant. The universities he built, the women he sent to those universities, the engineers and doctors and lawyers. This educated class would spend the next 4 decades in a complicated negotiation with the Islamic Republic, sometimes collaborating, sometimes resisting, sometimes leaving for Los Angeles or Toronto or London. He left SAVAK. Not the organization itself, the revolution dismantled it immediately. But the knowledge, the files, the techniques, the organizational structure of a surveillance state. The new government, within months, built Savama, and later Vivek. Intelligence organizations that, while different in ideology, were structurally identical to what the CIA had helped the Shah create. The Islamic Republic became a surveillance state, operated by people who had learned, either through participation or suffering, exactly how a surveillance state functions. He left an army that collapsed. Thousands of the Shah's military officers, the ones who were not executed in the revolutionary tribunals, fled abroad. Iran entered its most dangerous period, the 8-year war with Iraq, with a military that had been purged of a generation of experienced commanders. The consequences of that purge were measured in bodies. Hundreds of thousands of them. And he left something harder to quantify. A pattern. The pattern that foreign powers shape Iranian destiny. That Iran's leaders are installed or removed based on the calculations of Washington and London and Moscow rather than the will of the Iranian people. Mossadegh had said this. The revolution had been organized around this. And the Islamic Republic, whatever its many failings, has spent 45 years organizing its foreign policy around one central conviction. Never again. Never again will Iran be dependent on foreign favor. Never again will an Iranian leader be removed by a CIA agent with 2 suitcases. That conviction, even if it produced a government that tortured and oppressed its own people in different ways than SAVAK had, was grounded in something real. The Shah had made it real. Chapter 10, The Sons and the Daughters. In 1980, a young man left Tehran for the last time. He was the Shah's eldest son. He had been a military pilot, trained in America. He was 20 years old when his father was exiled. His name was Reza Pahlavi. He settled in the United States, in Potomac, Maryland, then Bethesda. He spent the next 4 decades as the symbol of a different Iran. The Iran that might have been. The heir to a throne that no longer existed, in a country he had not visited since childhood. He gave interviews, wrote books, addressed Iranian diaspora communities, called for the end of the Islamic Republic. He did not go back. And the Iran he talked about, the Iran he promised to restore, was the Iran of his imagination. The Iran of his childhood, before the revolution. The Iran of Persepolis and the White Revolution and the oil wealth. Not the Iran of Savak. Not the Iran of 100,000 political prisoners. Not the Iran of the father who wept on the plain. The story of Iran after the Shah is the story of a country trying to decide what it actually was. Not what the Shah said it was. Not what Khomeini said it was. But what it actually was. That question has not been answered. It is still being asked. By 30 million people under the age of 30 who were born after the revolution. Who have never known anything except the Islamic Republic. Who took to the streets in 2009. And 2019. And 2022. Chanting a phrase that became the cry of a generation. Woman. Life. Freedom. Not the Shah's slogan. Not Khomeini's slogan. Something new. Something that the Shah, in his excess, and Khomeini, in his certainty, could not have predicted. And something that the 2 suitcases of 1953 set in motion. Epilogue: the ruins of Persepolis. Persepolis still stands. The ruins of the palace that Cyrus built, that Darius expanded, that Alexander burned. The tourists still come. Carefully. With the right permissions. Under the surveillance of a government that is suspicious of too much interest in the pre-Islamic past. But they come. And in the stone, if you know where to look, there is a relief carving. Delegations from every nation of the Achaemenid Empire, carved in limestone, bringing gifts to the king. They are all there. Egyptian, Babylonian, Greek, Indian, Lydian, bringing tribute to a throne that no longer exists, to a king who has been dead for 2,500 years. The Shah stood at this spot in 1971 in his uniform and his medals and declared himself the inheritor of all of it. 8 years later, he was in a hotel room in the Bahamas. The ruins did not notice. Ruins never do. They outlast the kings who claim them. They outlast the revolutions that burn the cities around them. They outlast everything except time. The Shah believed he was building something that would outlast him. He built something, but not what he imagined. He built the revolution that destroyed him. He built the grief that is still being processed by a country that loved him and hated him and cannot fully separate the two. He built, through his excess and his paranoia and his dependence on foreign power, the exact conditions that produced everything he feared. Every Shah. Every king who mistakes a country for a possession. Every leader who believes that modernization can be achieved by force and that stability can be built on silence. eventually faces the same ending. Not with a battle, but with a plane lifting off a runway, while a city watches and says nothing. This has been Chronicle Arcanum. The past is not behind us. It is the throne we are still fighting over.